there than the place you just returned from, Cuba.
Yeah.
How was that trip?
It was very exciting. It was cool. It was really neat to be the second cabinet member to go to Cuba, and we went down there, you know, as the president has changed our policy where we're engaging with Cuba as opposed to a policy of isolation. So my trip was really a lot about trying to understand what's going on in Cuba. To meet my counterparts, I met with the vice president, I met with the minister of trade, I met with the foreign minister to understand where their head's at about the relationship with the United States, to also understand how does their economy work? You know, how do you import, how do you export, how do you distribute goods? And then also to do a regulatory dialogue. So I brought experts from Treasury and State and the Department of Commerce to understand how our rules could fit with their laws. And, you know, what we found is a state-run economy, right?
Shockingly.
Right. and so they're, to date, where they've gone is from almost 100% of their GDP being run by the state to about 25% now is run by what they call non-state actors and non-state leaders. We would call that the private sector.
Yeah.
But their private sector is defined very narrowly. About 200 different roles in the economy can be part of their non-state sector. So you could be a barber, you can own a restaurant, you can't own two.
You can't own two restaurants?
No.
Okay.
Your sister can, or your mother can, or your relative can, but you can only own one. You can, so it's a limit. You can drive, you can run a taxi cab type of thing. So it's limited what the private sector can do in Cuba. And so a lot of our conversations at the government level was, you want $2.5 billion a year of foreign direct investment, but there's a lot of impediments to that actually occurring. And in fact, trade has actually gone down with Cuba. And so we talked about the fact they have a dual currency. So they have two different currencies, which is a challenge. If you want to hire someone in Cuba, you need to go through a state-run employment agency where they produce candidates for you to consider hiring. So and they have a regulatory environment that is not so clear. So there's a lot of challenges for them going from where they want to be to where they are today to where they say they want to be. And there's things they've got to do to change, and obviously, you know, there's things we've got to do to adapt as well.
So is there anybody in this room that is eyeing Cuba to do business with? A sprinkling. What would be your advice? I noticed Airbnb is interested. What would be your advice to anybody looking to do business with Cuba or in Cuba?
Well, I think the first thing you have to recognize is we still have an embargo in place.
Right.
And so there's a limit to what sectors you can be involved in. So be careful about that. You don't want to break the law.
Right.
So second is I would actually spend time with either folks at the Commerce Department who can help you understand how to navigate there. But it's limited what's possible right now. And it's going to be a process. And my read of the Cuban government is they're very conservative, and they're not going to make these grand leaps. They're going to move by pilot projects and trying things and see how it goes.
So speaking of conservative, you were on the West Coast when the Chinese president, Xi Jinping, arrived. Things are less than friendly with China these days on a commercial level. Everything from cyber attacks originating in that country to forced technology transfers. And you were there having to deliver the bad news, basically business complaints. How did that go over?
Well, that was an interesting week in general. Remember, we had the Indians, we had the Pope, and we had the Chinese all in 5 days. So it was quite a week. And then we went to Cuba the next week. But it was an important conversation that needed to be had, and an important lead into the President Xi's visit here to Washington, which was to say, look, you're the second largest economy in the world, and it's extraordinary what you've accomplished. You know, 600 million people out of poverty into the middle class, amazing. But you've done that predominantly on exporting goods around the world. And the world economy can no longer absorb your excess capacity. And so the formula that's gotten you here needs to change. And that's was one part of the message. Another part of the message was, you know, that you can't keep stealing things through cybersecurity.
And how'd you put that to him exactly?
Well, you know, it was probably more artfully than I just did, but basically, you know, that we have to have you have to respect intellectual property, and that if you are becoming a first world innovator as an economy, and your companies want intellectual property protection. So this is not actions you're taking because it's good for the US businesses, but this is about your economy, and so going from where it is to where it needs to be as the second largest economy in the world. And that was really the framing of the conversation, which is you're at a pivot point as a leading player in the global economy. And I think together we're about 35% of the world's GDP, and we're about 1.6 billion people. And so as leaders in the world's economy, there are ways to behave in ways that are not good or conducive for global growth and global prosperity. And so that was really the framing that then allowed me to talk about, look, some of your laws that you're putting in place and the way that you're using them, whether it's your national security law or your anti-monopoly law or your NGO law, you know, is inconsistent with the kind of role that you want to play in the global economy.
How did he respond to you?
Well, it was interesting. They were, both Madam Peng and President Xi were always very cordial to me. And, but the policy conversation was really, it occurs at two levels, through speeches and then through speaking with his advisors. And his advisors were forthcoming, and in fact, on the topic of intellectual property protection, took me aside and said, look, we get it. We have to address this.
Really?
And, you know, now it wasn't like they said, oh, we agree 100% with
right.
everything that you've said, but there were certain areas where and the final message that I gave was, look, this is not about written outcomes from a visit. This is going to be really about your actions. Yeah. And we're going to be paying attention to your actions. So it was an important message, I think, that needed to be delivered and set the stage for President Xi's visit then here to Washington.
So staying in that part of the world, but leaving China out of this expressly, was the TPP trade agreement, which is a signature effort on your part, on the White House's part. But Hillary Clinton has come out against that. Has that made it more difficult for you to get that treaty passed? No. I think that you have to look at the facts, and I think this treaty is an extraordinarily important agreement for American economic leadership globally. And we have to keep some aspect of the politics aside and recognize what is really important. And I would submit it's extremely important for every one of you in this room, because Asia is the fastest growing marketplace in the world. It's gone from 500 million middle class to 3.2 billion middle class in the next 15 years. That is something we can all understand, 15 years. And if we're not in those markets, the companies that are there are just going to get stronger and stronger. This agreement has 5 major parts of it that are, I think, really important to defining
and important to keep in mind. First is market access. It lifts about 18,000 different tariffs on our goods being sold abroad, but it also allows imports to be less expensive, which is good for our economy as well. From the labor standpoint, it's the strongest labor standards of any trade treaty that we have, and it's within the agreement, it's enforceable, and each country has a plan how to achieve those labor standards. Why does that matter? That makes, as other countries raise their labor standards, it makes our workers more competitive. It addresses challenges as it relates to e-commerce and the internet. It prohibits tariffs on digital products. You know, it requires copyright protection on digital products. I can go on and on. Small business, for the very first time, there's a small business chapter, and it addresses issues like customs, complex paperwork that are impediments for smaller businesses. And then, of course, on the environment, it's robust, enforceable commitments by all the countries participating, and it requires countries to take an affirmative action to fight wildlife trafficking or overfishing, and adopt the Montreal Protocol to protect the ozone. These are massive changes that benefit U.S. businesses globally. It's really important that we get this done. It's strategic for the United States.
We have time for one question. Lights? Yes. Do we have a mic quickly over here?
Okay.
You talked about the opportunities in Cuba. Can you share your thoughts on how you're viewing foreign investment in Iran?
Well, what I would say about foreign investment in Iran is what will happen is, let's assuming Iran complies with the JCPOA, certain sanctions will be lifted, but others will remain in place. So I have not yet done the study, as opposed to with Cuba, as to exactly where the lines are for what is potentially possible for American business as it relates to Iran. It's the same sort of regulatory interface that we're doing right now with Cuba. I've got to study all that, so I can't really give you a lot of insight into the opportunity.
You know, we touched on the political campaigns going on this season about the TPP, but also Hillary Clinton has criticized the short-term thinking on corporations. Do you think that's a criticism that company executives should take home, that they're too short-term?
Well, I think that company executives live in, if you're running a public company, which is where I think the criticism of short-termism has existed, is you're caught between, the requirements of ISS, that you're shareholder focused, and the long-term benefit of your corporation. But I think any CEO worth their salt has got to be messaging what is their strategy, where are they taking their company for the long term, and focused on that. I think if you want to change the dynamic that exists, you have to look at all the stakeholders that are creating a more short-term focus, and you have to address all of that. You can't just criticize a CEO and say that it's their fault that they're not taking a longer-term view.
Last question. You've got, a year left in office, year and change left in office. Politics, public policy, this bucket, or business? Which will it be afterwards?
Oh, my plan is to go back to the private sector. As I told you before, I love building businesses, so it's been an honor doing this job. We have a lot left to do, and I spend every day focused on, we have a strategic plan, set of priorities, I'm focused on that. But when I'm done, I assume I'm back in the private sector.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Penny Pritzker, thank you for being here.
Thank you.